Hello, I'm Karina Reynolds, Executive Director of Center for Book Art. So it is my pleasure to welcome to the Zoom stage tonight, Sarah Nicholls.
Thank you, Karina. And I want to say thank you to all the staff at CBA, especially Zoe and Camillo, who helped me install the show. I want to also thank all of you for joining me here today and listening to me talk. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to take a look at this. Oh, wait, hold on a second. Let me do. Sound. Okay, so this talk is going to be all about land, and it's going to be about maps, and it's going to be about history, and it's going to be about the waterfront. And this right here, this is one of the first maps I'm going to show you, but I didn't make this one. This map is by a man named Evan Pritchard. His name's down on the bottom. He is the founding director of the Center for Algonquin Culture and the author of several books about mapping Native New York. So this is a map he made of Brooklyn before the arrival of the Dutch. And so, like Karina said, we're going to start off with an acknowledgement that all of the land that I'm going to talk about today is unceded territory of the Lenape people, specifically of the Canarsie, who lived in this yellow area down here. And that all of the history that I cover today, it's going to be the history of a stolen land, right? I'd like to point out two things about this map. One is I want you to take a look at the complex transportation system that you can see in red here, all these different pathways. And then I also want you to notice these villages down here on the southern edge. You'll notice that they're not right on the shoreline, they're back a little bit. And then there are pathways to get to the shore from these villages, right? And there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, I'm going to talk about pamphlets. So I started making pamphlets in 2010. And the reason I did this was because I was working on staff at the Center for Book Arts. And I had learned all these skills there, right? I had learned hand book binding. I'd learned hand typesetting. And I loved all these skills. But I didn't love the distribution methods for that kind of work. Most hand printed books that are hand-bound, letterpress printed, they end up in special collections. And special collections have a really important role in terms of preserving and protecting work over time, but there's a barrier there in terms of how people access the work, right? I wanted to make work that people could handle, that people could sit down with, that people could absorb, work that I can give to people, work that I can get out of my apartment relatively quickly, that I could get into the hands of readers in a really direct, immediate kind of way. So I looked at the history of print. These next couple of images, they're all going to be early printed pamphlets, mostly from the 17th century, part of an explosion in early print culture in Europe. It was a time when information was going to be circulated in the form of these really simple, cheap booklets that developed as a precursor to the newspaper, as a new form of media. And that covered all different kinds of subject matter, both high and low, true and fantastical, right? There were social and political arguments carried out over these pamphlets, lurid gossip, scandals, witch trial pamphlets, true crime pamphlets, pamphlets that have helped to invent science, all these different kinds of ideas getting tested out in this new media, right? Simple, cheaply made, printed from handset type and simple carved blocks. So I started making pamphlets. They're all printed from lino blocks. This is the lino block locked up in the bed of the press, and handset type, metal, set individually, letter by letter, space by space, paragraph by paragraph. I started with editions of about 50 to 75 copies, and I gave them out to friends. Mostly I mailed them to people, to a mailing list that changed every time and changed over the years, right? And over time, that list of people that I sent them to, it grew. I started taking subscriptions. In 2015, I started taking subscriptions. And the list grew some more with the subscriptions. Subscribers pay $45 and they get 3 pamphlets a year. And then subscribers also have the opportunity to nominate a friend to be added to the list as well. And so that aspect helped to grow the list over time as well. At this point, I have about 100 subscribers a year. And I'm doing editions of about 250 to 300 pamphlets each time, 3 times a year. This is one of the early pamphlets. So this is just basically a sheet of paper that's been folded up into a booklet. This is from, I think, 2013. Most of this work, it's something that people experience in their home. They get a pamphlet in the mail. It's hand addressed to them, so it's special. Doesn't look like the rest of their mail. They open it and they have this moment of surprise. They get this moment of discovery. And I get to have this really private experience where I explain to the audience, explain to the reader, explain to the people that I'm corresponding with, the story of something that I'm really excited about. Most of the things that I write and research, I'm not writing from the position of an expert. I'm writing from the position of somebody who wants to discover something new, that I'm trying to teach myself something that I don't already know. And then I want to explain that thing that's new to me to the people that I'm writing to. And so it's always got this sense of like discovery and exploration and surprise, right? So this is Broad Channel. In 2016, a friend of mine brought me out to Jamaica Bay to Broad Channel. Broad Channel is an island. It's the only inhabited island in the middle of Jamaica Bay. Jamaica Bay is a body of water right next to JFK Airport. So some things about Broad Channel. It's full of Irish Catholics. It's full of decorative nautical stuff. It's full of guys who own boats. This is a place where water is really sort of the center of life, right? In a good way and in a bad way. So this is one of the residential streets in Broad Channel. You can see it's lined with all these very small bungalows, right? And then on the right side, you see a house being under construction. So in 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit New York. Lots of different areas of the city were flooded. It was particularly bad in Broad Channel because it's at a really low elevation and it's surrounded by water. So here, 2017 is when I took these photos. The houses are still under construction. They're still repairing the houses. There was a city program called Build Back Better that gave homeowners money so they could raise their houses. You could see like the difference between this really short bungalow here and then this one that's much higher up. It's because it was been raised up on stilts so that it's going to be a little bit higher the next time the island floods in a big storm. But it took a really long time for that money to come through. And so a lot of homeowners, they had to abandon their houses because they couldn't hold on long enough to get the money to fix up their houses. And then this is the pamphlet that I made about Broad Channel. It's called Intertidal. The word intertidal is sort of the synopsis of everything that I was excited about in terms of Broad Channel, because intertidal, that's the kind of land that is computed on this, that this community built their homes on. It's a place that's both land and water at the same time. I really love times where I can keep 2 contradictory ideas in my head at the same time. That's something that I'm always really excited about. And so Broad Channel, Jamaica Bay, this place where there's land and there's water all at the same time, that's something I'm really excited about. And one of the questions I was wondering was whether it was even a reasonable idea, right? To build a community of permanent homes on an island like Broad Channel. The land here, it's all part of a network of marshy islands. So one of the things that I learned making pamphlets here was, what is a marsh? It's a place that's designed to flood, where it's supposed to flood, where the water level varies. Sometimes it's more inundated, sometimes it's less inundated. It's home to lots of different kinds of species that can tolerate salt water. It's home to oysters and shellfish. Often it's a place where birds and other animals can raise their young. It's a place where a really wide variety of species can thrive. Marshes also serve to protect places more inland from storms and floodwaters. So that when I pointed out the Lenape villages that are a little bit away, set back from the shoreline, it's because they want to be on higher ground and then they can come down to the marsh and gather shellfish, right? So this is a picture of the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Reserve. The northern part of the island that Broad Channel is on, it's all taken up by a wildlife reserve. It's part of Gateway National Park, part of the National Park Service. It's a man-made park. So here you've got, on the right side, you've got a freshwater pond, and on the left side, you've got a saltwater pond. And it's all been constructed. It was built by Robert Moses. And it's a constructed place for wildlife to come together. Because you've got the freshwater and the saltwater at the same place, you get a really wide variety of bird species that can all call this place home. So it's a mecca for bird watchers. It's right on the Atlantic Flyway, so that you've got a lot of migrating birds throughout the year. And it is also right near JFK Airport, like I said. And so it's this very strange place where you get to see lots of nature in the largest city in America. And so one of the things that I was thinking about throughout that year that I was making pamphlets about Jamaica Bay, I was thinking about, what is nature in urban settings? How are cities part of nature? And how are the things that we build just as much part of nature as the things that other species build? Something that I say all the time when I'm talking about these kinds of things is, if a beaver dam is part of nature, if a spider web is part of nature, then a city is part of nature, right? So this is the pamphlet I made called Flyway, that's all about the wildlife preserve. And it's got these sort of fold outs with illustrations, and then the text sits right on top of it like that. So you get this sort of like surprise reveal. And then this is an earlier map before industrialization of Jamaica Bay. You see Rockaway Peninsula right there. You see all these tiny little islands. You see that? So the idea with these islands is that sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're smaller. They're supposed to change over time, and that's the idea. They shift, they change, they move. Sometimes it's all more inundated, sometimes it's less. All of these smaller marshy islands, they eventually got dredged, and it got filled in with landfill to create this sort of new coastline, right? To make an airport and a highway and a park system. And the marsh all just started to, it started to shrink. So I'm going to show you a tool that I look at pretty constantly. No, well, not constantly, but often. So this is a sea level rise viewer. There's lots of different kinds of tools like that that you could look at that give you like various different versions of the same thing. This right here, this is Broad Channel. Broad Channel is actually the name of the community down here. And the whole piece of land is actually called Rulers Bar Hassock. You could see that right there. This is the wildlife refuge. This is JFK. This is the Rockaway Peninsula with the beaches. This is the Belt Parkway going along the coast. This is Canarsie, which is another neighborhood that I'll talk about a little bit later. This is Canarsie Pier coming out into the bay. This is a park called Shirley Chisholm Park that got built fairly recently. So this is what Jamaica Bay looks like now. There's many fewer marshy islands you could see. You've got some of the bigger ones left, but there's a lot less marsh than there used to be. So when I started writing about the subject, the prediction at the end of the century at 2100, we would be at maybe about 3 feet more water in New York City, right? And so this is what Jamaica Bay would look like with 3 feet more water. Since I started writing about this subject, the number has gone up. So they're no longer saying 3 feet at the end of the century, they're saying probably 3 feet somewhere in the middle. And then by 2100, it'll be at 6 feet, right? So this is what Jamaica Bay looks like with 6 feet of sea level rise, right? So you've got Broad Channel, the nature reserve, it's all gone. A lot of the Rockaway Peninsula is gone. The Belt Parkway is gone. You can see here in Canarsie, the residential neighborhood in Canarsie, it's starting to flood. So there's big changes coming to Jamaica Bay this century, right? And I just want you all to be really clear on what that is going to look like. This is another neighborhood that I've written about, and it's a similar kind of situation, right? So this is Red Hook. This is the Red Hook container terminal. These are the docks in Red Hook. This is the Gowanus Canal. And this is the Gowanus Expressway. This down here, these are the piers in Sunset Park. There's going to be a huge shift in this landscape over time. Part of the reason why there's going to be a big shift in Red Hook is this. So if you look at this map, this is a map before industrialization, before the sort of industrialized waterfront, before Red Hook became one of the biggest ports in the country. The water line, you can see the Hudson River here and then Gowanus Bay here. And then this is a visualization, and unfortunately only goes up to about here, but the visualization of what the coastline looked in about 1600, right? And so you can see this is where the original coastline was, and then this is what it looks like now. Now the difference between these two, between this and that, there's landfill, right? So a really common thing in New York City is we'll take a bunch of rubble, debris, land, we'll put it in the harbor, and then we'll build on top of it, and we'll sort of create real estate out of nothing, okay? So you've got docks here, you've got, this is something called Atlantic Basin. It was the first sort of dock that was built in Red Hook. And then this is Erie Basin down here, and they're both built on landfill. I'm going to show you some pictures of the neighborhood. It's a really, really beautiful place. I love it. These are some of the old 19th century buildings. This is one of the docks, one of the piers, I'm sorry. This is part of Erie Basin. This is what the harbor looks like. There's still some commercial traffic in Red Hook. In the 19th century, it was one of the biggest ports in New York City. But by the 1970s, of course, containerization, most of the commercial boats, it went to New Jersey instead of Brooklyn, right? There's still a commercial port just north of Atlantic Basin. There's a cruise ship terminal there as well, but it's nowhere near what it once was at its height. In the 20th century, Robert Moses put in a highway, which sort of cut the entire neighborhood off. But the thing I'm really excited about when I talk about Red Hook is weeds. That's the thing that I'm really excited to talk about. And so the reason why I got really excited about weeds in Red Hook was the show that I saw at Parsons by an artist named Maria Teresa Alves. And her show, it's all about something called ballast weeds. Ballast weeds are weeds that arrived here in ship's ballast, materials that ships would carry below deck to weigh the ship down just enough so that it'll float. Ships today use water as ballast, but in the 19th century, they would use debris. They'd use soil, whatever they could pick up from the last port they were in, and then travel to the next port, and they dump out the soil in the harbor, right? Ballast weeds grow from the seeds that are concealed in that soil. And so you can see examples of them all over Red Hook now. Erie Basin was built on ship's ballast. The developer who built it would pay ships a fee if they dumped their ballast in the area he was trying to build on. Alves is interested in ballast weeds as this sort of physical reminder of historical trade routes, right? So it's like a thing where history is actually physically present in the landscape. So in a port city like New York, what that means often, the shipping routes of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as shipping routes of all the cash crops that slaves grew in the South, brought up to the North for sale, right? She had collaborators grow examples of all of these plants from seeds and then brought them into the gallery alongside her work. So her show got me all excited about weeds and how they function and what they represent and how they came from and how they can be used. And so I worked on this whole series of pamphlets all about weeds in 2019. So this is Plant Out of Place. It's one of the 3 pamphlets I made about weeds. It's about Red Hook. It's about the history of Red Hook, and it's also about weeds. Urban weeds creating their own ecosystem in abandoned places, in neglected places, providing food and shelter for other species. Weeds improve the soil, especially in soil that's been sort of contaminated by industrial runoff. They can be used as food, they could be used as medicine. They could also be used as raw material or as dyes, right? And then this is a map that I made. This map is a map that I made in residence in 2019 on Governor's Island through an artist collective called Works on Water. So I started making these large maps, and what I wanted to do in these maps was document sort of how this waterfront changes. So you see, this is the original coastline right here, this gray graphite part. These yellow bits are marsh, these green bits are park. This is a huge public housing project that was built in Red Hook in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. And then these orange bits are places, they're brownfields or other kinds of remediated areas of industrial waste that were left behind by all the manufacturing in the neighborhood back when the port was bustling. This is the Gowanus Expressway that cuts the neighborhood off from the rest of Brooklyn. And then this right here, this is a Lenape pathway. So like I said, the Lenape didn't necessarily live right on the coast, but they did have these pathways so they would get to the coast and gather shellfish, gather mussels, gather hay. So this building, this is the Norwegian Seamen's Church. It's on Pioneer Street. I think at the time it was called William Street in the 19th century, but this is the Norwegian Seamen's Church, and it was sort of like a community center for all of the Norwegian immigrant sailors in the neighborhood, right? There was a huge community of Norwegian immigrants that came to the waterfront in Brooklyn, including my great-grandfather, who lived and worked on the waterfront just south of here in Sunset Park in the beginning of the 20th century. Then this is a pamphlet I made in 2020 called the Morse Dry Dock Dial. That is about my great-grandfather and about Sunset Park, and specifically about Bush Terminal, which is the name of this huge complex of docks and warehouses and train tracks in Sunset Park in the first few decades of the 20th century. This is part of what is in Sunset Park now, what's left of that. So this is one of the buildings that's been redeveloped since then by a group of private investors is Industry City. And then this one here, which has sort of been left to molder, sort of empty and deteriorating. And so starting in 2017, I organized periodic walks with readers around the neighborhoods I had been publishing pamphlets on. I brought people to Jamaica Bay. I brought people to Red Hook to talk about weeds. I think that weeds build community, and they're a way of teaching people about a place. In 2020, though, especially in the spring, people weren't gathering with friends, even outside at first. So I made this video walk. This is an excerpt of that video walk for people to watch at home so they could see the place I was writing about. They could see Bush Terminal. They could see the park I was writing about, and they could learn about that place just at home. These are some of the cats. And the whole point of the video is sort of to teach you about the history of the neighborhood and how the different parts of the neighborhood fit in. The parts that are sort of deteriorating, like up here like this, and then the parts that are being redeveloped and how that sort of interplay between those two works. So apart from walking, I mostly do my research for these pamphlets by bike. I think it's important to think about all of the different kinds of ways of moving around a city, all of the different kinds of transportation networks you can draw that aren't just a network of highways or driving routes. This is one of my favorite bike routes right here. So this is the Jamaica Bay Greenway. This is the Belt Parkway. This is another kind of place where you've got two opposing ideas that you could hold in your head at the same time. And the Jamaica Bay Greenway, it takes you past, let's see, takes you past a beach, takes you past a riding academy, takes you past all of these different inlets. So right here, this is something called Patagat Basin. This is the Belt Parkway right here, and you can go right underneath it. And then this is a map that I made in 2020. This is sort of like the continuation of the first map series. This is a handmade map. This piece of land right here is called Mill Basin. This is the Belt Parkway in pink. And then you could see all of the tiny little marshy islands that used to be here. And you could also see how the sort of the coastline has been sort of transformed and consolidated through landfill. So I made these maps, the second group of maps, in residence at Brick House in downtown Brooklyn in the fall of 2020 during the pandemic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process of making these maps at the end, but these are some of the maps that are on in the exhibition at CBA right now. And then this is the pamphlet I made about the Greenway. It's called Fresh Creek. And it's about a bike ride I took all the way out to Shirley Chisholm Park. It's a park that's built on the southern edge of the Belt Parkway on a former huge garbage dump on the southern edge of East New York. The waterfront at that point was totally inaccessible to the residents until the park opened, really. There was just this huge landfill, this huge garbage dump right in front of a big housing complex called Starrett City. So this is a view from the park. So this is Shirley Chisholm Park, and you can sort of see Starrett City right there. They didn't have access to the waterfront until this park opened. And so it's this amazing resource for the residential neighborhoods that are further inland. And it also helps protect the residential neighborhoods because all of this garbage was piled on the edge of the city for years. It's really high in elevation. So there's this big hill in the middle of the park, and it's going to actually help the residents here protect them from floodwaters going forward. You could also take the same Greenway out to Canarsie Pier. Canarsie Pier used to be the site of an amusement park called Golden City way back at the early part of the 20th century. And this is the pamphlet that I made about Golden City and Canarsie. And then this is the map of Canarsie. So earlier I showed you that sea level rise map. This is a big residential neighborhood that is going to have, it's going to start to be transformed because it's going to become more under threat of flooding. This is Canarsie Pier. This is where the Shirley Chisholm Park has been built. This is Starrett City. This is the Belt Parkway. And you can sort of see where the coastline used to be and where it's been built out. And then this is, I made a second video, Walk in 2020. This one is for Canarsie. So, that.
Dozens of small creeks once flowed through the marsh into the bay, but almost all have been buried, dredged, or completely erased by development. This coastline almost became a seaport. They dredged the marsh to clear the way. But the seaport wasn't built, and now it's public space. I've never gone fishing, but I bet it's a lot like bird watching. Lots of sitting and watching, waiting, paying attention. Paying attention to the details as a way of slowing down time. Slowing down time is a way to think about context, the pace in which we live.
So finally, I want to talk about Coney Island. A lot of people probably are familiar with Coney Island. This is what Coney Island looks like now. Coney Island was one of the string of barrier islands along the southern edge of Long Island until it was connected to the mainland landfill in the 20th century by Robert Moses when he built the Belt Parkway. This is what it looks like now. And that's what it's going to look like with 6 feet of sea level rise. So you'll see lots of it is going to be gone. Lots of it over here is going to be gone. And part of the reason is, if you look here, a lot of this part of Coney Island, so this whole part right here, it was built on landfill. And the other reason why is this is Coney Island Creek. So basically a lot of the land right here has been covered up by landfill as well. This is the pamphlet I made about Coney Island. It's called Place Without Shadows, and it's mostly about questions like, what is a beach? It's a word we use for lots of different kinds of landscapes, but your understanding of what a beach is isn't necessarily what my understanding of what a beach is. What a commons is, what is a commons? Is it possible to own a beach? Is a beach a commons? And then should individual people own a beach? This is what it looks like once you unfold it. It's also about the question of what will happen to this area in the future. Large numbers of residents live in public housing constructed on landfill in Coney Island. And a lot of that's going to be underwater soon, at a time when we're not just not building new public housing, we're also not able to maintain the public housing that we have. And so a lot of this is going to disappear. So when I look at a map like this, I think, where are all those people going to live, right? And then this is Coney Island Creek. Most of the pamphlet is about this particular body of water, not necessarily like the more well-known ocean-facing beach. I'm really interested in this body of water specifically because it's relatively inaccessible, but it's got all these gorgeous sort of mud flats and beach. There's like some beach area, and it's just a really interesting ecosystem, I think. And then there's all of these abandoned boats. You could sort of see one right here. So this is an abandoned boat graveyard as well. This is a sunset at Coney Island Creek. And then this is the handmade map I made about Coney Island. So you can see this is where the water line used to be. This is where some of the housing projects are. This is a park called Calvert Vaux, which is where most of these photos were taken. That's the belt. This is Ocean Parkway. And then these are the subways. And so I want to take a second and talk a little bit more about these maps. So these maps I made in residence at Brick House in downtown Brooklyn in 2020 in the fall. And I based them a lot off of research that I did online. So this is a tool called Map Warper that you could use to take sort of historical maps and put them on top of Google imagery. So you could see how those two different things line up. NYPL used to have a tool that you could use to take all of their historical maps and do that with. I think they closed that project down, but you could still access the basic tool Map Warper on the internet. And then I also looked at things like this. So this is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And they have like this map that you could use where you like check off like what places have been remediated, what places, like where does the sewer runoff end up when there's a storm and the sewers get overwhelmed and you get a whole bunch of water getting dumped that hasn't been treated at a sewage plant into the waterfront. Like, where are those places where that happens? You could look up all of that stuff on this map. And the other thing that I'm going to say about these maps is that I got a grant in 2020 to make paper. In the very beginning of 2020, before the pandemic, I got a grant from the Brooklyn Arts Council to learn how to make paper. And the reason why I wanted to learn how to make paper was I wanted to learn how to make paper from weeds specifically. I wanted to gather weeds off of the waterfront and turn it into paper and use it in projects. And so some of the paper in these maps has been handmade from weeds that I've gathered from places like Calvert Docks. This is Queen Anne's lace that I've used as both a dye and as a substance to be made into handmade paper. This is Japanese knotweed that I gathered and turned into paper. So you could see this is paper that I made from this plant. This is sort of the finished sheets. And then this is a mix of, I think this is a mix of cotton and Queen Anne's lace and corn maybe. And then this is my studio while I was making them. So the paper making process was really fascinating for me. The paper that I made, I didn't necessarily make these entire whole sheets, but the things that are collaged onto those sheets. So all the paper for the highway system, or for these Lenape pathways, or for like the beach at the end, all of that has been handmade and collaged onto the bigger sheet, if that makes sense. So they're drawn, they're collaged, they're sort of pasted together, both from machine-made papers and handmade papers. And I wanted to have that sort of combination of weeds that I've gathered, and then also cash crops like cotton or hemp or flax that sort of reflect all of the different economies in New York City, and then machine-made papers that I bought. That seemed to me to be the most accurate representation of the whole sort of landscape that I wanted to visualize. And then this is the installation at CBA. So you've got all the pamphlets on a shelf, so you could read them and you could handle them, you could touch them. And then these are two of the maps. So this is Coney Island, and then this is Canarsie, and then the maps sort of extend onto the wall. And then I wanted to give you a list of some of the sources that I had for my research. So these are two of the tools that you could use to see where are the places in your community that are under risk of sea level rise. What are the different kinds of, what is your home community going to look like in at the end of the century? These are some digitized historical map collections that I used. These are some tools that will help you layer old maps on top of the present. This is the DEC site that I mentioned, and this is the Center for Algonquin Culture that I mentioned right up front at the top. That's my presentation. I think we're doing Q&A now, if I have that correctly.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much.
Hi.
So at this point, I think we can allow people to, if you want to bring your questions into the chat. I'm sure that Sarah would love to ask them. I did see one person ask a question earlier about the maps, and can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yes. Let's see. So the maps, what materials did I use to create the maps and what scale? So the maps, they're about, some of them are like maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, and then some of them are a little bit bigger, like 4 by 6 feet. So they're definitely much, much larger than the pamphlets, right? And what materials? So some of it is handmade paper. Some of it is paper that I bought. So some of it is masa, like a roll of masa that I used to create sort of like the base layer. And then I would collage on top of it with all these different handmade papers. The thing about the handmade paper is I just started learning how to do this. And I was doing it in my kitchen, right? Because like I got this grant to learn how to make paper, but I didn't have access to a papermaking studio. I didn't even have access to actual papermaking classes necessarily. I learned online over Zoom. I learned in my kitchen. And so I'm very much at the beginning of my papermaking journey. And so it's one of those things that I'm really, really excited to sort of grow from and learn more about.
And
Artists.
I was
Yeah.
just going to ask you a little bit more about that. You kind of extended your maps in the installation at Center for Book Arts. So for all of you who are online right now and you haven't yet had a chance to come and visit, it does kind of like expand the whole idea of the maps and connect them. And is that the same material that you're using in the installation?
Yeah. So the extensions are all handmade paper as well. Yeah. And some
great.
of it is commercial fibers like cotton. So you can buy half stuff cotton, you can buy hemp, and then you can remake that into remake that into sheets that I can then dye and then cut up into pieces and make those extensions.
I'm personally very curious about your subscription model, because I've been a subscriber and I'm sure that a lot of people on the call right now have been subscribers. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you've set that up, because it's so generous the way that you kind of allow for someone to recommend another person to get one of the copies of your books in the mail. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you've structured that.
So I've structured it so that every subscriber gets 3 pamphlets a year. I try to publish in the spring, summer, and fall usually, although sometimes a little bit late here or there. I send them pamphlets in the mail, and then the subscriber has the option to nominate a friend to the list as well. And the goal is, when I started this whole series, I wanted them to be sort of surprise gifts. So for the subscribers, I want them to have that opportunity to give a surprise gift. I want the surprise gift to be sort of a central thing in the series, right? And then the other thing about it is, because I don't know their friends, it expands the reach of the series and it expands the audience for the series, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I see that Norma Markley has a question in the chat. Did you interview the residents as part of your research? The sense of people in your work, there is a sense of people in your work, but it's mostly about the land.
It is mostly about the land, and I try to focus it on the land partly because I'm coming to most of these places as an outsider. So I try to talk to residents as much as I can, but I think that I'm always going to be doing it in the way where I'm an outsider. And so by talking about the land specifically, it's less sort of an outsider, like parachuting into a community, and more about the landscape, right? And that's my sort of entry into the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my experience reading these, it really does feel like you're getting almost kind of like a secret view into the history of the space through the plants and the culture that you're describing. I especially loved the ones about Red Hook and the the barge. What did you call that? The
ballast weeds.
The ballast weeds. So fascinating.
Yeah, I think ballast weeds are really, really interesting. I love Red Hook, and one of the reasons why I want to write about places like Red Hook and like about Jamaica Bay is because I know that these places aren't going to be around forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I did know that I noticed that Norma had, oh wait, no, it wasn't Norma. Somebody else had their hand up earlier and I didn't quite get to them yet. If you guys, Ron Jensen has a question. So far, your studies seem to be focused on the southern edge of Brooklyn, and will you continue up the coast towards Manhattan to fill out your scheme?
Yeah, so part of the reason why I'm really interested in the southern edge is there's 2 parts of it. One is that I think that places like Williamsburg and Greenpoint, places like Dumbo, places, especially like the Gowanus Canal, I think that those sort of waterways have been really well documented by artists, partly because there's really large artist communities in those neighborhoods. And so I feel like those places, they have it covered, right? I've made maps of those neighborhoods, but most of my research is in neighborhoods that haven't necessarily been as well documented or researched, or hasn't had as much attention paid to them. And then the other reason why I'm focused on the southern edge is because I find that landscape really, really engaging in terms of, you know, the marshes and the waterways and the way that land sort of like ebbs and flows and changes over time. I really like barrier islands. I grew up on the south shore of Long Island, so I'm already on the southern shore. So where I grew up, it's basically, if you just walk east from all of these neighborhoods that I'm talking about, it's all the same island, it's all the same kind of landscape. And that's partly why I'm so attracted to it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I see a comment here from Nicholas Dumont Estevez. Thank you for making these publications accessible. I'm wondering if you have thought about using these publications to kindle community discussions about what is happening in regards to water, commodification, ecological crises, displacement, and more.
Yes, I try to get them out into the community and into the hands of people who are addressing that. Part of the reason why I had the residency with Works on Water is because I thought that was a really great artist run collective that is focused on all of those issues, right? And so they do publications, they do events, they do exhibitions, they do talks and symposiums that are all around those issues. And so I try to get these publications in the hands of people who are addressing all of those kinds of issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, I see another comment or question here from Sarita Zaleha. Are your pamphlets collected by NYPL? I feel like they are, right?
I feel like I've had a conversation with a librarian from NYPL, and then I contacted them and they didn't follow through. So if they are here at this talk, let's talk.
Okay, yes, let's make that connection. And also Sarita asks, curious whether they might be shared through the library. With so many libraries having circulating zine collections now, this would be a great way to make them accessible. Yeah,
that would be great.
Copies.
Yeah.
Oof, so good.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
And for anyone who's looking for back issues, if you're not a subscriber, we do have some here available at CBA to purchase. And that supports Sarah and her practice. But yeah, absolutely. Something that we need to figure out is how to get you into NYPL as well as many other collections.
Yes, because that is a goal. The other thing I want to say is that the maps that I made, I do want to make a printed version of them and turn them into an atlas. So that atlas, it's sort of like a longer term, bigger book project that I'm interested in working on, taking these maps, putting them into book format, putting them into printed format. And so that will be a sort of a limited edition that would specifically end up in special collections, like NYPL, hopefully. And the idea with a book like that is that I want that to be in a special collection specifically because they're going to sort of preserve it and hold on to it over periods of time. So once these places are gone, there's a possibility they'll be documented in that special collection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this might be a really good project for our Washington hand press because it has such a large press bed.
Possibly, yeah.
If you wanted to do some hand carved maps.
Yeah. Ron
Oh.
Jansen asked where I make these pamphlets. So maybe this is a good point to mention that I make my pamphlets at the Center for Book Arts, so in the print shop, which is where I do all of my printing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to watch these coming into existence over the course of many, many days, the typesetting and the printing and sewing, everything. Okay, let's see. Can you talk a little bit more about your journey to develop this project and kind of like how this came to you?
I think that it has developed a lot over time because I've been making pamphlets since 2010. So like my thoughts on what I want them to do, how I want them to function, what I want them to cover, it sort of changes. It's changed a lot over the last 12 years, right? And the more I research these kinds of topics, it's sort of like I start with something that I'm interested in, and then it sort of grows out from there, right? 'Cause a lot of these topics are really sort of interrelated. I'm building on the idea of landscape. I'm building on the idea of city as nature. I'm building on sort of the role that these pamphlets can do in terms of documenting climate change over time, right? So it's really sort of like a thing that builds as, you know, like a boulder running downhill, right? And that's kind of
Absolutely.
how I feel it changes.
Yeah. Can you speak quickly to how your practice as a pamphleteer affects your work as an instructor at CBA? Because I feel like we haven't talked about that very much.
Yeah, I think that it's good because it means that I have a lot of examples that I could show to students and that are accessible to students. And I think that for me, teaching is sort of a performance. The teaching is sort of a way of instructing. A teaching is sort of like a hands-on version of communicating with people one-on-one via the printed word, right? I try to bring the sense of history and of materiality into the classroom. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this comment from Ana Paula Cordiero, which says, I love how Sarah has reclaimed the USPS to art via the mail, analog forever, which is so in the spirit of Center for Book Arts and what we do here. It's amazing the amount of mail art we get at CBA. And I always think about the extreme pleasure I have when I receive one of your pamphlets in the mail. Well, I think we are nearing the end of our time tonight. We've got just a couple more minutes. So if anyone's got one last question they want to squeeze in. I see that Nicholas is suggesting, and I think this is a great idea. Have you ever thought about making these available online as PDFs? Maybe not so much for downloading, but for accessibility. I think that's an interesting question.
I think it is an interesting question. People ask me that from time to time. Part of the reason why I did the video walks was because I wanted to have something that was really accessible online for viewing and reading and experiencing. I've always been sort of reluctant to put the pamphlets online because I feel like there's something very specifically analog about that. I think a lot about, I didn't talk about this earlier, but I think about like original 17th century pamphlets created a reading public. And so what I want to do with mine is create a reading private, where there's this one-to-one conversation between me via the metal type and the sort of reading voice in your brain. So I can just sort of sit down with somebody in their living room and tell them the story. And I think if I put it online, that sort of changes that whole relationship, right? But I do think that having some kind of documented information on the internet is important. And that's why I sort of made the video walks to start off with. And I think I want to continue to do it. And that's going to be the way that I have some of this content on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, Ron Jansen is saying the materiality of the pamphlet is so important. Don't put it online.
Yeah.
For all those who haven't been able to see Sarah's work in person in the past, we do actually have a lot of these pamphlets in our collection at Center for Book Arts.
Yeah,
so
there are.
In addition to the ones that are in the exhibition right now, there are even more that you can see if you reach out to our librarian, Jillian Lee. They can help you see more of Sarah's work. And yes, Camilo, our artist programs manager, is just reminding everyone that Sarah's exhibition is up until March 26th at Center for Book Arts. So please come through, visit in person, bring all of your friends, tell everyone that you know. And also Sarah has 2 classes coming up. One that is on, actually they're both on letterpress printing, right, Sarah?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So feel free to enroll in that to get a little bit of Sarah's magic in your life. Well, Sarah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. This has been an absolute pleasure. And if anyone has additional questions, you're welcome to reach out to us at programs@centerforbookarts.org with questions, and we can forward those to Sarah directly so she can get in touch. And
Absolutely.
please subscribe.
Thank you.
All
Thank you
right,
very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you everyone for coming.